Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Past Pawns. Today we're going to be talking about the Bishop F5 variation in the Jobava London system that arises from the move order D4, Knight F6, Knight C3, D5, Bishop F4, and Bishop F5. This is kind of like a mirroring system where Black chooses to play Bishop F5 and doesn't really commit to anything quite yet. So we're forced to decide on how to play, and then Black is going to be able to respond based on that. Now, thankfully, I've prepared a variation that allows us to play this very simply, especially if you watch the previous videos. As it turns out, most of these variations simply transpose into variations that we've already seen in previous videos. And so there's very little to actually cover. It's probably going to be one of the shorter videos on this system. So we're going to play e3 as our main response. Our opponent is going to play e6. This is the most logical continuation. The only real kind of sideline that anybody has ever played here is the move c6, and c6 isn't scary whatsoever. This is just kind of like a Slav defense type of situation now, where you're going to play f3 and then you're going to follow up with g4, h4, h5. This is something that we've already seen. I'm just going to go and give you guys a brief example of what that might look like. For example, e6 might be next, and these might, transpose into each other, so the move order isn't as important. But if our opponent plays e6 first, we're never going to play just f3 right off the bat. So if you see c6, you can start with f3 and g4. If your opponent plays e6, you can continue your plan. Anything else is subpar compared to e6. For example, normal development of the piece like knight bd7 is already not very good because of g4. Sending this bishop back, and then h4, we've kind of achieved a very nice advanced structure where we're just going to move the queen either to d2 or d3 in some time, of course not right now. And then we're going to castle queenside, and our king is going to be nice and safe, whilst Black's kingside is going to start falling apart. So if our opponent plays e6 here, we're going to still continue with g4. The bishop retreats back, we hit him with h4. And then if you see h6, there's no point in playing h5 here. In all of these cases, you usually want to play g5. Rarely do you ever want to play h5. In the future, after bishop d3 and the straight occurs, here it makes sense that you wouldn't ever want to have your pawn on h5. You want it on h4 so that you can play the move g5, open up the kind of structure, put your bishop on a nicer square, pin this knight to the queen and whatnot, and just continue your attack. Anyway, that is exactly what you're going to do, actually. And if you're going to encounter h6, you're going to play bishop d3. This trade is most logical. Of course, if this trade doesn't happen, you're going to be quite better. Retreating here is too slow, it wastes the tempo, and anything else ends up just ruining Black's pawn structure. Don't really worry that much about that. Trade your pieces. Play knight bd2 if you get this bishop trade offer. That way, if your opponent takes your bishop, you can recapture the knight. If you want more insight on that and the way to kind of continue this sort of attack, please make sure to check out the previous Jobava London videos. What happens if after e3, our opponent plays e6? Here there's been a couple of moves that players have tried. The one that I have found the most interesting and the one that has been popular very recently among top grandmasters who play this opening is knight f3. This is because we want to play knight e5 and then continue with g4, kicking this bishop out, h4, h5 ideas, or h4 and g5, like I've previously mentioned. There's a couple of ways that Black can play here. Primarily, we're going to face two moves, bishop b4 and bishop d6. So both of these are going to be quite easy to manage. Let's start with bishop b4. This one is the most kind of forcing line. That's why I wanted to go over it first. You're going to play bishop d3. You want to trade this bishop off. You are not worried about this trade happening because you're going to play c4, and eventually that's just what's going to happen. This is usually what opponents do. Of course, they might delay by a couple of moves. Black might not take this knight right away. However, they will take it eventually because that's the whole goal of playing bishop b4. You're not really doing anything besides that. The reason we play bishop d3 is to enable the castling of our king shortly, and we don't want to really castle queenside in this sort of situation because bishop b4 kind of makes it very difficult for us to create a kingside attack. Not that we can't, potentially play queen d2 and castle queenside, but this bishop is going to be very annoying to deal with, so it's better for us to just play kind of safe and secure, castle kingside, and not really push our pawns as much as we normally would, and just focus on just having a slightly superior pawn structure and piece placement. So like I said, eventually this knight's going to get taken. You're going to recapture back. You're going to push it to c4, and there's a couple of ways that this can happen. So after you castle, if you get, for example, knight d7, you're going to play c4 here. This trade is necessary because if it doesn't happen, and let's say anything else like rook e8 or even knight g6, you just play c5 and you're better. This knight doesn't really have anywhere to go, so it has to retreat back to d7. Now, this does look kind of ugly for us because we have a pawn on c5 and c2. However, one thing to keep in mind is that this knight is completely neutralized. It doesn't have any squares that it can go to right now, besides, of course, its home square on b8. So you've kind of neutralized the knight, and that looks pretty good. And also you have the ability to play c4 quite soon. You can actually do it like right now, and you're going to be a little bit better than black. You're just going to have better pawn placement and better piece activity. So none of your pieces are as inactive as this knight is. That being said, if your opponent does take this pawn, you're going to simply recapture the bishop. If instead of taking the pawn, your opponent chooses to capture your bishop first, this is important. You have to recapture with your c-pawn. You don't want to recapture the queen. I mean, you can, but you really shouldn't. This is quite good because afterwards you're simply going to be in a superior position. And if your opponent doesn't choose to trade these pawns and plays anything else, let's say once again rook e8, you can take this pawn first and foremost. If the pawn recaptures, you have the ability to play something like rook e1 and then e4 in the future. If the knight recaptures, this is going to be a little bit different. Here you're going to have to focus on retreating this bishop first and then playing e4. And then you're going to focus on expanding with this sort of central pawn mass that you've acquired. And you're not really worried about the doubling of these d-pawns. You're just going to push them and you're going to be all good. That should cover pretty much everything with what happens after this bishop takes right away. Now let's look at what your opponent might play if they want to delay the capture of this knight for a couple of moves. So knight e4 is possible. Knight e4 is quite annoying. Obviously, it targets this knight. The knight cannot capture because it is pinned to the king. So you're just going to capture the knight with your bishop. The bishop is going to have to recapture if the opponent chooses to recapture the pawn, which is going to be really weird. You have even knight e2 in this position. You're going to castle, and then you're going to focus on recapturing this pawn. And the reason that this isn't really good for black is because this bishop is quite bad now. It is staring into its own pawn. It can't really retreat anywhere, and it's just on an awkward position. So knight e2, going to be fine right there. If the bishop recaptures, you have the very simple castle. And after all these trees occur, once again, the same ideas are prevalent in this position. You're going to play c4 at a certain point, and you're going to start by playing knight e2. This bishop's going to have to move somewhere. It might not move anywhere, and then you're just going to take it, and you're going to be better. For example, if your opponent once again plays rook e8, capture this bishop, ruin the pawn structure, and then c4 is a great move, great possibility right there. However, most opponents are going to play something like bishop g6 instead of rook e8, the more logical move. And here you have enabled the move c4 for yourself and allow yourself to expand. So after this pawn gets captured, and obviously it might not get captured, there's an infinite number of things that your opponent can do. This is like the most logical, most straightforward response that your opponent can make. And in that case, you're simply going to recapture the pawn with a knight. And from here, your ideas stem a little bit differently than the rest of the variations we've seen, where you've castled queenside and you're expanding on the king side with g4, h4, g5 ideas. Here, we're going to be focusing on playing things like rook b1, maybe moving this knight back to d2 and playing c4. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that you should be careful with playing rook b1 and moving this pawn out because this bishop is obviously going to capture your rook. So to avoid that, you got to stick to one plan. If you're going to play rook b1, don't push this pawn right away. And if you're going to play knight d2 and c4, don't play rook b1 just yet. Alternatively, you can also play h4 and h5, trying to kick this bishop out. Usually just going to go to h7. But in that case, you have something like queen g4 and ideas of taking this pawn with your bishop, technically sacrificing the bishop, although this pawn is pinned to the king. So you have opportunities to create attacks and various strategies to combat this bishop. So I would say that this isn't the most problematic position. Your development is quite easy and the game is very simple to play. That covers everything to do with bishop b4. Now let's look at bishop d6. By the way, if you guys have been enjoying this video, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps me out a ton by pushing my content out there to more people, and it will help you stay notified for when future videos come out. Thank you. Bishop d6 is a lot different from bishop b4. Our playing style switches completely. And at this point, we can continue with our original idea with knight e5. You're most likely going to face, knight bd7. This isn't something that is forced from your opponent. Your opponent might castle, and from there, you're still going to play the same things. You're going to follow up with g4. But most of the time, and the most testing move is knight b to d7. The reason for that is that more pieces attack this knight and prepares to take it. You're going to play g4. This is the whole original point of playing knight e5 in the first place, to continue with g4 and try to kick this bishop out. Most likely, your opponent is going to capture your knight with the bishop. The opponent cannot capture your knight with their own knight. Reason being is that you recaptured the pawn and now you're forking these pieces and you just won a piece and most likely the game. So therefore, your opponent must capture with the bishop. In that case, you can capture their bishop with your pawn, and you're going to get something like this position, which is very interesting. It's hard to say who exactly is winning. Both pawn structures are ruined. You're going to castle queenside very quickly, and you're going to be fine there. Your opponent has a very easy target of d4 with your pawn, so you got to watch out and protect your pawns. Now, a big thing here is you're going to have to push f5 at a certain point because you have doubled these pawns. So it's very important that you trade one of them off in order to kind of undouble these pawns and have your pawn structure be slightly better. The thing is, this position is quite equal, and it could be quite hard for both sides to play this actually. So just be careful, push this pawn up, castle queenside as fast as you can, and you will be quite fine. Last but not least, after knight f3, there is this interesting move a6 that some people have tried. It's kind of just like a waiting move, trying to see what white's plans are. We simply follow up with knight e5, and then you're most likely going to get knight bd7 once again. There really isn't that much besides knight bd7. I mean, your opponent could take the passive route and play something like h6, in which case g4 is once again applicable. That being said, after knight bd7, you're going to play g4, and we're going to get into a very similar situation that we've just discussed. And after the knight captures, you're going to take this bishop. However, here, you have a slightly more superior position because your pawn structure isn't ruined. In fact, only black's pawn structure is ruined. So you have that advantage. This is obviously preferable to the previous situation where you had a pawn on f4 and no bishop there. And so if you're able to get yourself into that position, that'd be slightly more preferable, though both options are completely playable. Ladies and gentlemen, this summarizes everything I wanted to show you for this bishop f5 variation in the Jobava London system. I hope you guys found this useful, and if you did, please consider checking out a video to my left. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in a future video.